Now, William Lane Craig has pointed out that one can be an epistemological naturalist and still reject metaphysical naturalism. So that is to say that one could think that the only way to gain knowledge is through science and empirical observation, but that perhaps God and angels and souls do exist. They just don't think we could ever know that. There are good reasons to reject metaphysical naturalism, that nature is all that exists, and this is the focus of the rest of my talk tonight. Unless stated otherwise, I will refer to metaphysical naturalism simply as naturalism. Now, as I've already pointed out, scientism is logically self-refuting, and therefore it's false, as it offers a knowledge claim that is assumed apart from scientific discovery. Sometimes the advocates of this view will exclaim, well, you gotta start somewhere. I respond to that statement by saying that one should start with the laws of logic as opposed to science, because science presupposes and is based on the laws of logic. One self-proclaimed empiricist once accused me of circular reasoning. However, the fallacy of circular reasoning, also known as begging the question, is a logical fallacy not based on science. So this skeptic was essentially appealing to logic in an attempt to defeat logic. Therefore, he inadvertently affirmed logic. You see, logic is bedrock, and I hope you take that away from this discussion tonight. Logic is bedrock. You can't get beneath it. If one wants to start with science instead of logic, then they need to provide scientific reasons that do not assume logic to explain why one should not start with the laws of logic. Why? Well, consider the fact that everything I can think of, mathematics, science, the historical method, and even theology itself, are all based on and assume the laws of logic. Logic is bedrock. Think about this. If NASA thought little green men on Mars existed, well, they would be justified in conducting missions to see if they could empirically verify the existence of these green Martians. However, if NASA stated that married bachelors were living in Montana, drawing triangles with 4 corners, and jumping out of infinitely tall bottomless pits, well, one would not need to exert any effort at all to travel across the state line to empirically verify if this is true or not. Why? Because it's logically impossible for bachelors to be married. It is logically impossible for triangles to have 4 corners, and it's logically impossible for anyone, even a super Martian with infinite jumping abilities, to jump out of an infinitely tall bottomless pit. You see, science is not necessary to attain this knowledge, although logic is. So unless the empiricist can provide a means of reasoning that does not require the presupposition of logic, then logic, as opposed to science, is the correct starting point. Logic is the ground level and foundation of reaching reasonable and true conclusions. The professor of logic at Oxford University, Dr. Timothy Williamson, asks the question, and I quote, "Why can't there be things only discoverable by non-scientific means, or not discoverable at all?" End quote. This is a valid question that the naturalist must answer. Moreover, imagine if we had only developed 4 senses instead of 5. Suppose humanity never evolved the sense of smell. Would that imply that there were no odors or scents? Does that imply that there would be no smellable things? This raises the question, why can't there be things that would be detectable if we would have developed a 6th sense, or perhaps a 7th sense? To simply respond, just because, is not a good answer. It's not an academic response. You see, just as creatures without noses should still be open to the idea of the existence of smellable things, the epistemological naturalist should still be very open to the idea of the supernatural. Epistemological naturalism, as I've explained, is self-defeating and therefore false. However, even if someone is committed to that incoherent position, they have no basis for rejecting the existence of things that are not detectable by our five senses. This includes God. Dr. Williamson reiterates the point I've already made. He says, and I quote, "It is not discoverable by hard science that all truths are discoverable by hard science." End quote. You see, scientism fails its own test, and therefore it cannot be true. People who hold this illogical position lose all grounds for rejecting Christianity on an intellectual basis. Now, with all of that said, even though there are good reasons to believe that epistemological naturalism is false, namely it's self-defeating, it does not logically imply, even if it were true, that metaphysical naturalism must be true. It follows that one can be an epistemic naturalist and still be open to postulating immaterial aspects of reality, even if doing so, if doing so is an inference to the best explanation of our experiences. Therefore, an epistemic naturalist should believe in God, I believe. Or I believe they should believe in God after contemplating logical arguments, many of which we will examine this year. Arguments such as the cosmological argument, the Leibnizian argument from contingency, the fine-tuning argument, the moral argument, the ontological argument, and the free-thinking argument against naturalism, just to name a few. The inference to the best explanation is what we're after here. And the inference to the best explanation is a reasonable faith, as opposed to a blind faith. You see, naturalists hold to a blind faith that nature is all that exists. However, Christians can hold to a reasonable faith, which is supported by much scientific data as well. Dr. Williamson from Oxford University concludes, and I quote, "Epistemological naturalism is not incompatible with religion." End quote. Therefore, there's no good reason for an epistemological naturalist to reject Christian theism. The cumulative case of evidence demonstrates that there is much more to reality than simply matter, nature, and physical things. These arguments are based on logic, and many of them, as I said, are supported by scientific data. Now, science is the study of nature, and therefore is impotent to disprove or prove or even talk about things other than nature, what we call supernatural. With that said, however, I want you to think about this. Scientific data can strengthen premises and philosophical arguments leading to logical conclusions with supernatural significance or theistic implications. That's a mouthful. Let me say it again. Science cannot directly prove or disprove the existence of God, souls, angels, demons, or anything immaterial or other than nature. However, science still is useful. Scientific data can strengthen premises and philosophical arguments leading to logical conclusions with supernatural significance or theistic implications. Psalm 19:1 says, "Day after day, your creation pours forth speech. Night after night, it delivers knowledge." Accordingly, you see, when one studies God's creation, studies nature, they can gain knowledge. You see, some theologians study God's word, others study his work. That's the job of a scientist. You see, scientists are actually theologians, whether they realize it or not. Scientists study the work of God. Science and God are not in conflict, even though science and some religious claims might be. That's the topic of our next discussion in 2 weeks. Come back for that one. Thank you.